1980, Camp Crystal Lake. A teenage boy relaxes in his bunk and lights a cigarette. Suddenly he feels a drip of liquid hit his forehead and realises that there is blood seeping through from the top bunk. Before he has time to even comprehend this, he is suddenly speared through the neck by a psychopath hiding under his bed. After the huge success of John Carpenter's Halloween, a small-budget independent movie that went on to become one of the most profitable movies of all time, Paramount Studios took notice. They realised that there may be serious money to be made from psychopaths dismembering misbehaving teens. Friday the 13th took the most successful aspects of Halloween, but ramped them up, adding the one thing that Carpenter's movie lacked: gore. With makeup artist Tom Savini coming up with grotesque and inventive ways of killing off teenagers, Friday the 13th seemed to create an ideal formula to drive young audiences into cinemas. While John Carpenter's movie was born from ideas and is considered a piece of filmic art, there are many who accuse Friday the 13th of being no more than a simple cash-in, a franchise opportunity. Is this the case, or is there more to Friday the 13th than meets the eye? Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of the slasher and review Sean Cunningham's 1980 classic, Friday the 13th.
You see, Jason was my son, and today is his birthday.
Welcome back to the Evolution of Horror. My name is Mike, and as ever, I am your host. If you're joining us for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres across a number of weeks. We're currently in the midst of exploring the evolution of the slasher, and this is part 7, Friday the 13th. Now, don't forget, you can always get in touch with us anytime. Drop me an email. It's evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter @evolutionpod. And the other thing I keep forgetting to mention is that there is also a Facebook page, facebook.com/evolutionofhorror. Please do go and like that page. It's only got about 10 likes at the moment. That's mainly because I've forgotten to tell anyone that it exists. So there is a Facebook page out there. Please do like us on Facebook and get involved in conversations. I love hearing from you guys. I love hearing your opinions on the horror films we've covered so far, on ideas for what we could cover next. General feedback is always great to hear. And before we get started, I just want to do a very quick thank you to everyone that has left such lovely comments on iTunes this week. I really, really appreciate it. So a big thank you to Dapper Chapper, Lucky Newt 91, Echo Base UK, and Rich B40. Thank you so much to all of those people. Some of those reviews, particularly some of those reviews this week, were really way too flattering, to be honest, so thank you very much for those. It's really, really lovely to read. And remember, if you do want to drop us a little review, then please do. You can do that on iTunes, on your podcast app. I would love to hear from you guys, and I will give you a shout out next week. Now, let's crack on with our review. There's quite a lot to cover this week. We are predominantly going to be talking about Friday the 13th from 1980. That is the original movie. And we're going to be talking about that in spoilerific detail. That's your big spoiler warning. If you haven't seen the movie, maybe go away and watch it and come back. We will also briefly cover all of the sequels, because you can't not talk about all of those sequels, especially seeing as Jason Voorhees himself isn't really in the original. So we do mention all the others in a less spoilerific way, so don't worry, you don't have to have watched sort of 12 Friday the 13th movies in order to listen to this episode. So, joining me to discuss all things Friday the 13th is a very good friend of mine. He has previously co-hosted on the podcast before. Welcome, a huge welcome back to Rob Watts. Hello, Rob.
Hello,
welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Lovely to have you back.
Lovely to be here.
So, we are going to discuss probably, I would say when you think slasher, you think this franchise, I would say. I'd say may not necessarily be the best, but it's the most iconic. It's in some ways the most famous slasher franchise, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I'd say so.
Yeah,
and it kicked off the slasher boom.
It did. I think that's it. I think, up until this point, we've talked about all of the forerunners. We've talked about Psycho, Peeping Tom, we've done Giallo, we've done Black Christmas, and we've done Halloween, of course. And all of these movies are so important and in some ways are all brilliant. Probably better than this film. But I think really, and we'll get into this film is the one that made it a thing, that made slashers a thing.
Certainly.
I would say, that cashed in on it, really. Before we get into the story of Friday the 13th, I mean, that won't take long to go into.
No.
I think it's interesting to talk about the origins, because I was reading about how this film came to be, and Sean Cunningham, who directed it, he I think at this point openly admits that this wasn't even a story. This was just a title. This was a cash-in.
This was a cash-in.
To myself, if I had a movie called Friday the 13th, I could sell that. But the problem was I didn't know if I could get the rights or if there were rights involved. And so took out a big full-page ad in Variety. It said, Friday the 13th. It crashes through glass, and this is the most terrifying film ever made.
And why did you take that ad? Just to raise money?
No, I wanted to take that ad to see if anybody would send me a lawyer's letter saying, hey, you can't do that.
He basically came up with the title Friday the 13th before it was anything, and he kind of did it for fun and bought the rights to this title and put it in a magazine as an advert or something, and then basically got contacted by distributors, and I think it was Paramount that got in contact with him and said, yeah, we want to make this into a film, and then he had to come up with something essentially. And right. I think pretty honest about the fact that he took Halloween, which John Carpenter had made this very, very cheap film that had taken the world by storm,
of course,
and he thought, I want to do that too. How can I come up with a cheap format very similar that will make me lots of money? And clearly it did. So already from day one with this movie, it's already kind of slightly more cynical and more vacuous, I suppose, than everything that had come before it. And this is the movie that kind of gives the slasher the reputation that it has.
And I suppose it actually influenced the genre in many, many ways, in positive ways, but also in a huge amount of negative ways.
Yes.
Most likely being the copycat.
Yes.
And the sequel.
Yes, absolutely. So let's get started, shall we? Let's get into our feature review of Friday the 13th.
Friday the 13th. You may only see it once, but that will be enough. Friday the 13th.
So you've got a bunch of camp counselors in America. Kids go to camp and they've got these teenagers who look after them and do activities with them. So these camp counselors are on their way to Camp Crystal Lake, that famous location, and they're there getting ready for the season, and suddenly they start getting killed. Mm-hmm. And that's it, really.
That's pretty much
There's
it.
Not much more to it. Obviously, more of the story comes clear as you watch the film.
Yes.
But essentially, the setup is a bunch of teens at a lake. Someone is killing them.
Yeah, absolutely. And, compared to the sequels where I think later on down the line you see the killer, this is all done kind of point of view, isn't it? It's actually got a bit of a murder mystery whodunit type thing. Although I don't know whether it's trying to be that or not. I don't know whether we're supposed to think that one of these characters is the killer.
I don't know about that, but it's certainly more interesting to not know who it is than every one of the sequels where it's not POV. You can see exactly who it is.
Yes.
You know exactly why he's killing them.
Yeah.
Well, sort of.
Yeah.
That intrigue is something that is really, it's not unique, but it's unique to that first film in the whole series.
Yeah, absolutely. So the movie starts, and it's so interesting because, I think, the opening scene, you couldn't be more kind of ripping off Halloween if you tried, really, because you've got this POV shot of somebody looking in at two teenagers who are they're looking. First of all, they're looking after children. They're singing songs around a campfire with children. So again, it's kind of got that babysitter type thing. I mean, it's the next thing on from babysitter, isn't it? Summer camp counselor.
Yeah, it's pretty much the same.
They're responsible for the welfare of children.
Hallelujah, milk and honey on the other side.
And then you've got these two camp counselors that go off and they're fooling around having sex, and then they get horribly killed.
We weren't doing anything. We were just messing up.
But like even just comparing that opening scene to the opening scene of Halloween pretty much tells you everything you need to know about the differences, I would say, in these two films, because it's a kind of pale imitation, I think, of the opening of Halloween, where Halloween, it has that music, it has that lighting, it has that build up, it has that creepiness. Even the kind of POV shots, I think, are better. This is kind of like, okay, we're kind of painting by numbers at this point.
Exactly. It looks cheaper. It just goes straight for it. It doesn't think about how do I want this to look particularly.
Yeah.
All I know is that I'm not going to show the killer, and 2 people are going to die.
Yeah.
And that is it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose the main difference with this as well, compared to Halloween, obviously Halloween very famously is very, very restrained when it comes to blood and gore.
Yeah.
And this is where slashers become gory from Friday the 13th. It's much more about Friday, like the money shots, I suppose.
Yeah, that bit where everyone cheers or gets grossed out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that is the selling point for this film, and probably for most Friday the 13th movies. I think these first few, the makeup effects were done by Tom Savini, who was kind of a legend when it came to this kind of thing. And I think some of the death scenes are pretty good in this. What do you think?
Maybe it's because
convinced?
I've seen 30 years of
Yes.
other horrors. I think it's rather restrained.
I suppose I know what you mean. They're restrained if you look at some of the sequels and how extravagant some of the kills got later on down the line. But I think at this point, they were pretty shocking. They're pretty graphic. And actually, I think they're done pretty well. But they are brief, I suppose. And they're all quite quick. They're over in a second.
Yeah.
It's like a very, very brief shot of an axe flying into a head and then it cuts away.
No lingering as that person sort of about to fall back or...
Yeah, exactly. I suppose not giving you enough chance to look at the effects, I suppose.
Yeah, which obviously they couldn't afford too much of.
Yeah, but I think actually generally, considering for the amount of money and for the filmmaking itself, I think they're pretty good.
Yeah.
One or two really iconic ones now as well, which we'll probably go into later.
Yeah,
but there's some really brilliant death scenes, and I think that's kind of the selling point of this movie, and I think that's kind of the selling point of slashers from this point onwards. You know, John Carpenter's Halloween was about the tension and about the, Michael Myers and the evil.
There was a bit of psychology there as well. Yeah.
And now from this point onwards, we're basically tuning in to watch young people get killed in interesting ways. So again, this is what cemented that trope, I would say, Friday the 13th.
For sure, as it cemented lots of other tropes, which we'll talk about. As we go on. But it's definitely an iconic, legendary film in the slasher pantheon.
It is, definitely, yeah.
So the opening scene ends, we cut to those title credits, that really kind of over-the-top music, and then we meet our characters. Let's talk about the characters, if we could talk about the characters.
If I can remember any of the characters, other than the unseen killer.
Yes. I mean, you've got this group of kids, obviously. Now, I couldn't tell you a lot of their names. I know the main girl, the sort of final girl, her name is Alice.
Well, from the start, I didn't realise she was going to be the main character.
No.
So what you learn about final girls is they usually turn up at the start.
Yes.
And they're usually still alive at the end.
Yes.
In this film, there's a really pretty single girl on her own.
Yeah.
And she gets killed before she even makes it to camp.
It's a very weird...
I thought she was going to be the final girl.
That is a weird thing that they do. It's almost like a Janet Leigh type situation.
Yeah.
We have on the one hand this girl who turns out to be the final girl, Alice. She's played by Adrienne King. At this point, we haven't really seen much of her. Instead, we're spending a lot of time with this other character called Annie, played by Robbie Morgan. Basically, the story is kind of split at this point in 2 strands, and we've got this whole group of kids arriving in Camp Crystal Lake together, and then we've got Annie, who's by herself making her way to the lake, and this is our kind of surprise second death scene, I suppose.
Hey, wasn't that the road up for Camp Crystal Lake back there? I think we better stop. Please?
So Annie's trying to make her way to the camp. She gets in the car with a stranger. We don't see who this stranger is driving. We're kind of seeing from the driver's point of view. And obviously what happens is this girl is murdered. She tries to escape out of the car, is then chased into the woods and gets her throat slit in a really kind of graphic, pretty much the first proper graphic death scene of the Friday the 13th series, which is great. And I suppose in some ways this works very similarly to the scene in Halloween directly after the opening scene. So we've had our opening kill where the little Michael Myers kills somebody. Then we jump forward 15 years and we show how he attacks the doctor and the nurse, steals the car and heads towards Haddonfield and kind of sets up where we are now in the story. This is very, very similar because we saw our opening death scene in the late 1950s. Then we jump forward 20 years and we see that there is now a killer on the loose. It may be the same killer, it may be a different one, but they are heading in the same direction as this girl, also towards Camp Crystal Lake. So it kind of works as quite a clever little narrative function, I suppose.
That Jeep then appears later on and you're like, oh,
yeah,
okay.
Yeah,
she's getting closer now.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like when you look at it more closely, it does have a few quite clever storytelling techniques in that respect, you know. It was quite an interesting way to set it up. And then obviously you have got this other group of actors. I'm going to briefly, and now I'm not going to lie, I've got the IMDb list in front of me. That's how I know
They're
their
such
names.
memorable characters.
So you've got Marcy, who's played by Janine Taylor. She's the one that gets the axe in the head.
Okay.
You've got Alice, who's our final girl, played by Adrienne King. And you've got Bill, played by Harry Crosby. And you've got Jack, played by Kevin Bacon.
Ah, Kevin Bacon.
Now, of course, Kevin Bacon, I don't think he was a well-known actor at this stage. I think it was one of his first roles.
Yeah.
And he's not a particularly big part in the movie, but he does have the most memorable death scene, I would say.
He does. Definitely the most memorable and probably the best.
Yeah.
You know, there's a couple of slit throats.
Yes.
You know, nothing remarkable. I mean, it's pretty nasty.
Yeah.
But his death is much more iconic than those.
Yeah, totally.
Like, he's lying in bed, post-coital.
Yeah, of course.
He gets a knife up through the neck, through the bed, through his neck.
From the bottom bunk.
Or is it? No, it's not a knife, it's a harpoon.
It's a spear or kind of a thing, isn't it? Yeah. It's great. I mean, that is like, if you've seen Friday the 13th, that's usually the scene that stays with you, I think. That's the death scene everyone remembers.
Although there is one more death scene at the end.
Yeah, that's a good one as well. That's a good one. Everything else, like you say, there's kind of slit throats and that kind of a thing. I mean, the girl that we were just talking about, the girl who we thought was going to be our star, I thought that the scene where she gets her throat slit was actually quite good. Maybe it was partly because it took me by surprise at the time.
Yeah.
But I also thought it was a pretty good practical effect.
For sure, yeah.
I thought, quite convincing. Again, I think Tom Savini's makeup effects are a big selling point of this film, one of the main selling points.
Where was he in his career at this stage? Is this one of the first things he did?
Yeah, I think he'd done Dawn of the Dead, which was a huge thing for him in the late 70s. But yeah, I think before that, not much, because obviously he was a Vietnam War veteran and a war photographer, and he had taken photos of lots of obviously quite horrific things, and he kind of talks about that was his way of dealing with it, almost, of how he came to deal with these images and these horrible things that he saw in Vietnam, was to kind of recreate them and make them not real, almost. So it's quite an interesting thing, and he obviously is the master at it. Before the days of CGI, he was one of the best people in the game, I would say, at the time. So yeah, I mean, thank God they had him with this movie, I think, because if they had taken a restrained approach like John Carpenter did with Halloween, this movie wouldn't have much to recommend it.
No, there's nothing that will stay with you, because it's not particularly suspenseful.
No, exactly.
It has, like we said, it has some interesting ideas that then get lost along the way.
Yes.
But yeah, visually, there's nothing to it really, except these interesting, well-made death sequences.
You're going to Camp Blood, ain't you? God damn it, Ralph, get out of here. Go on, get. Leave people alone. You'll never come back again. Oh, shut up, Ralph. It's got a death curse.
And what did you think of Crazy Ralph, crucially?
Crazy Ralph?
Crazy Ralph is the guy who goes, "Don't go there. It's got a death curse."
Yeah, well, I'm pretty poorly acted, if you ask me. But, a good omen. They just listen to the crazy guy.
Yeah, always listen.
You'd never have a film if they actually were like, what? It's cursed.
Oh, let's go.
We should probably leave. Yeah.
Yeah, let's call it a day.
Yeah. It was a good jump scare when he was in the cupboard.
Yeah.
I
also think that, do you think that the kind of woodsy Crystal Lake setting, I mean, do you like that in general? Do you think it's better than the kind of suburban Halloween setting, for example?
I think both have merit.
Yeah.
I find Home Invasion far scarier
Yes.
because
That's the
I'm
one
mostly
place
at home.
Yeah. It's the one place you're supposed to be safe. Yeah.
But woods are scary,
Yeah.
inherently scary in the dark.
Yeah.
And, there's a whole lineage of those films set there as well. But yeah, scary, especially when as a teenager, you're in charge of other people. You're the adult, essentially, in that situation. And you have got no way of looking after yourself.
Yeah, totally.
That's pretty scary.
But we should talk about the score, the music.
Yes.
What did you make of the music?
I quite liked it.
Yeah.
It's certainly memorable. I hummed the little motif earlier on. And that's quite clever.
Yeah.
It tells you that the killer is there.
Yeah.
Because you've got this one motif. I'm not sure that Halloween did it in quite the same way.
No. I think it kind of had that sort of... Obviously, it had that John Carpenter piano music. I don't know whether it always signified that Michael was there or whether it just ran throughout. Yeah.
Sure. And at times, the strings were kind of reminiscent of Psycho, I thought.
Very. Yeah.
Which, if you're going to steal,
yeah,
Psycho's the one to steal from.
Yeah.
So I quite enjoyed the score, actually.
Yeah. I think it worked really well. And obviously, that little motif, that little... that is like so... it's almost more famous than the film itself now, I would say, isn't it? It's like so much like drilled into all of our subconscious.
It's quite funny. I think Alice Cooper did the soundtrack or some of the soundtrack to Part 6, I think.
Oh, yeah.
And he actually incorporates it into the song
Yeah.
for the film, which is bizarre, but it just shows you how iconic it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Still going after 6 films.
Yeah.
It's made it into a pop song.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, it's one of those... It came from... the word kill and the word mum, and which is again quite interesting, quite an interesting, clever thing. Because obviously, when we find out who the killer is, and that's what it's about. It was Betsy Palmer saying the word kill and saying the word mum, and then they added effects to it. And
that's interesting. I did not know that.
Echoed it. Yeah.
See, I read because I thought it was
yeah.
It's actually
yeah.
Kill her, mommy. Kill her.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now I see.
So it's kind of cool. Yeah. So there's more than meets the eye, maybe, with Friday the 13th. That's the thing. There's more to appreciate if you dig a little deeper.
All right, well, let's continue with the story. I mean, I'm not going to go blow by blow all the way through the narrative of Friday the 13th like we did with Halloween a couple of weeks ago, because I feel like this movie doesn't really merit it quite as much, to be honest. But essentially what you get then for the whole middle section of the film is the kind of spending time with the characters. You've got kids fooling around in the camp. You've got a few fake jump scares here and there. Crazy Ralph pops out of a cupboard. You've got someone, the prankster, who pretends to drown in the pool. You've got a snake that comes into the cabin. The snake gets beheaded. That's a bit of a sort of harbinger of what's to come towards the end. And you've got a lot of these kind of point of view shots. We always hear that iconic music when the killer is stalking or watching them. And essentially, after we're done with a bit of character development, and I mean a bit, we then start the murders. And by this point as well, it's turned to nighttime. And actually, one thing I do really appreciate about Friday the 13th is that you've got, as well as that kind of wood setting and a lot of kind of focus on nature, I suppose, the water, the lake, the snakes, it's all very much kind of back to basics with Friday the 13th. And Friday the 13th has this thing that runs throughout the series that a lot of people call pathetic fallacy. If you've heard about that, it comes from sort of literature. It's essentially where the weather reflects the mood, I suppose, or, somebody's emotions are enhanced or reflected within the kind of natural surroundings of where they live. And that's very much present in Friday the 13th. And of course it's present in a lot of classic horror movies. Every horror movie is set on a dark and stormy night, and this is no exception. So it's a huge thunderstorm that's happening as these murders are taking place. So that kind of adds a little bit to the atmosphere. Alice finds herself the only one left. She finds herself in that classic final girl situation where she is suddenly discovering all of the bodies. She has nowhere left to run or hide, and all of a sudden she stumbles into a very friendly middle-aged lady called Mrs. Voorhees.
How are you? Well, I'm Mrs. Voorhees.
So let's talk about the killer then.
Okay.
Because obviously, I think, again, Friday the 13th, you will always associate it with Jason Voorhees.
Yeah.
And of course, there is no Jason Voorhees in this film.
Well, there is.
A
but
little bit.
He's not the killer.
Yeah.
Is the big thing.
Yeah.
You know, most people, like you say, picture hockey mask, machete,
Yeah.
and Jason.
Yeah.
And that's nowhere to be seen.
Yeah.
In fact, the killer is his mum.
Yeah. And, you know, actually a really great killer, like a really cool last act, I thought, to this movie. You know, she, compared to the other kind of, you know, the sequels and the Halloween movies, where you have this kind of faceless, voiceless killer that just looms and walks and kills and does very little else.
And is practically immortal.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Mrs. Voorhees is very much real. She's like, she has real motives, she has a real personality, and she really dies and stays dead as well. She's a real human.
The motives, like, yes, Michael Myers has some sort of motive, though in the first Halloween, you don't know what it is.
No.
Which is interesting in itself.
Well, whether that's scarier or not is is up to the audience, I suppose. But yeah.
But this film, you find out she has a motive,
Yeah.
a legitimate motive. Okay, not to kill people, but you know, at least there's a reason behind
Yes.
it. She's killing them as revenge.
Yeah.
You know, you find out that a couple of the counsellors were off, you know, having fun.
Yeah.
And someone drowns.
Yeah.
Her son drowns. So she wants to take revenge. And she does.
And it kind of, in a warped, psychotic way, does make sense, though, when she explains it and she says, I couldn't let them open this place again. And, you know, I think it works, actually. And it's a very simple idea, but an effective one, because obviously a scorned mother is something that you would believe, you know?
Yeah,
that's the thing. And,
sure.
you know, she does it really well.
You let him drown. You never paid any attention. Look what you did to him. Look what you did to him.
Yes, it's quite over the top towards the end. She does ham it up a little bit.
She certainly does.
But I think that works. You know, for this type of a movie, I think you need a bit of ham.
Yeah.
They're not going for subtlety in this, are they?
No, they're not
That's
going for
sure.
subtlety, but also they're not going ridiculously over the top. And she is fallible.
Yes.
You know, she gets kicked down.
Yes.
She stumbles.
Yeah.
She ultimately actually dies.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, these things don't happen in the sequels to any of these films.
No, it's so interesting. Like, it's so interesting when you look at the genre, like, the franchise, to where it got with, you know, Jason in space, and you look back and you think, this is how this started, with this just like quite unassuming middle-aged woman who wanted to kill teenagers.
So young. So pretty. Oh, what monster could have done this?
I just want to go back to what you mentioned earlier about the sex thing, the sex equals death thing. I mean, that's something we've talked about on a lot of episodes leading up to this, but here is where it comes absolutely front and centre. This whole idea of if you have sex, you die. And that's something that has been used over and over again since, hasn't it?
You see it in practically every film. If they're not having sex, they're doing something else ridiculous.
They shouldn't be. Yeah.
Hey, you want a beer?
Or do you want to smoke some pot?
Or we can have premarital sex.
The influence it's had
Yeah.
throughout history come all the way till recent films such as It Follows, which finally does something fresh with the whole sex and death thing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's funny because, again, you know, it might be that a lot of people would blame Halloween for starting this, but I think that was, as we discussed a couple of weeks ago, I think that was coincidental almost, the kind of puritanical aspect of Halloween. Whereas with this original Friday the 13th, it is absolutely pure and simply the reason they are dying is because they are having sex. I mean, it's what starts the whole thing. Obviously, Jason was this little boy who drowned because two teenagers who should have been looking after him were having sex. Their promiscuousness caused the death of an innocent child. And therefore, Jason represents, you know, the punishment almost that all teenagers deserve for having sex. And that's why this trope is invented here with this movie. It's part of the narrative with the first movie, but the narrative goes completely out the window with most replicators and most sequels. It's more just a coincidence that, yeah, okay, if these teenagers are misbehaving, they're gonna die, and they deserve to die. And it's so interesting because it's this kind of very old-fashioned view in these very
what you'd think would be edgy movies, but actually they're not that edgy. And I think this is something that Dan Martin mentioned when we were talking about Giallo and Bay of Blood, but the kind of puritanical aspect of Friday the 13th is what made it appeal to such a wide audience. That's why Middle America ate this stuff up as well. Early 1980s, we were on the brink here of Reaganism and the AIDS epidemic, where people were scared of sex. So this is a classic example, I think, of horror films absolutely reflecting the sort of consciousness of what was going on at the time.
Did you know that a young boy drowned the year before those 2 others were killed? The counselors weren't paying any attention. They were making love while that young boy drowned. His name was Jason.
A lot of die-hard horror fans love Jason Voorhees as a character, and I think because of that, you don't always see enough appreciation for this in horror circles, I would say. If you look at lists online where people rank the Friday the 13th or whatever, it's never the original that's at the top.
It's not, no.
And I think a lot of that is down to Jason. I think people like the faceless, like, kind of juggernaut that is Jason, but I think Mrs. Voorhees was excellent.
It's a far more subtle killer approach, and there's actual emotion behind it.
Yeah.
Whereas you look at, I guess Jason is taking revenge himself.
Yeah.
For his apparent death, but he's not dead.
Yeah.
And then his mother's death.
Yeah.
But for so long, I feel like the motivation gets lost at some point.
It does.
And now he's just killing for the sake of it.
Exactly. So, we get this final act with this brilliant underrated slasher killer, Mrs. Voorhees. It really comes down to a proper kind of scrappy fight between her and Alice. They're rolling around, hitting each other with things, and finally it all comes to a head, quite literally, when Alice decapitates her with an oar, with a rowing oar. And it's fantastic. It's a great little practical effect there where we see that head fly off with the hands that are still moving as the headless corpse kind of slowly collapses. It's really great. It's really well shot. It's really well pulled off. It's a great little moment and, a great little farewell to probably one of the most underappreciated slasher killers of all time, Mrs. Voorhees. What I love about Mrs. Voorhees as well is that, yes, she's got a motive, but it's not like a really overcomplicated motive. It's such a pure, simple thing that everyone can understand.
The fact that, yes, she's taking revenge for her dead son, and then he's not dead, and it kind of undoes the power of that first one as well a bit, doesn't it?
It really does. And it completely undoes the power of the final scene.
Yes.
Where your final girl, what was her name? Alice. Where your final girl, Alice, is in the boat, and Jason launches out of the water and drags her. Now, watching the film standalone, it could have been a dream. I guess it still could be a dream.
Yeah.
But bringing Jason in the next film suggests that it wasn't. But up to the point that they made a second film, it's actually quite ambiguous.
Yeah.
And it's the scariest moment in that film for me.
Oh, it's
because you just don't expect it. Like, for all you know, Jason is dead.
It works so well, that ending. I think it's perfect, And again, it's this Friday the 13th is just a movie that is just there for fun. It's there for the fun money shots and for the jump scares. And it's kind of started that whole kind of audience mentality, I would say. Of
Definitely.
Kind of sitting and jumping and laughing and all that kind of thing. But
and I guess it also started that final moment dream sequence, which just gets used and used.
Although Carrie, I suppose, Brian De Palma's Carrie from a few years earlier, it kind of took that a little bit. But yeah, you're right. And then it totally that last scene you could totally believe was a dream, or just a fun sting ending. And then in the second one, when they suddenly start referencing, oh yeah, no, rumor has it Jason was alive and he witnessed his mother's death and now he wants to get revenge. And it's like, so what's Jason been doing for like 20 years?
Has he just been lying at the bottom of the river, waiting,
or just like hanging out in the woods, just watching people,
Yeah, because if he was alive and he was seeing that his mother was really upset that he was dead, maybe he'd just go and tell her.
I'm all right, Mum. I'm actually
fine. You don't need to kill anybody.
Yeah.
And he's still there.
So Friday the 13th had the reaction that you pretty much would expect with most horror films. It had complete critical failure, but amazing commercial success. It was made for just under $500,000 and grossed $40 million, and that's just domestically. That's not even including worldwide. However, critics were not very nice about it. Roger Ebert gave it 1 star. Gene Siskel called Sean S. Cunningham one of the most despicable creatures ever to infest the movie business. Variety claimed that the film was low budget in the worst possible sense, with no apparent talent or intelligence to offset its technical inadequacies. Friday the 13th has nothing to exploit but its title. The film was also nominated twice that year for the Golden Raspberry Awards for Worst Picture and Worst Supporting Actress for Betsy Palmer. But regardless of all of that, it did make a shit ton of money, and so sure enough, 1 year later we get Friday the 13th Part 2. So let's talk briefly about the sequels then, what came after. So obviously Friday the 13th, it was very much a kind of standalone piece. It was a movie about kids getting killed by this woman taking revenge for her son. Then it became something entirely different. So we've got 10 or 11 movies that came afterwards which were all about Jason, more than about the kids or the final girls or anything else, I would say. It's really about Jason, and it's about how does he kill people.
It's definitely that.
Yeah.
It's definitely how many kills can he get? Because as you know, first film, something like 10 people die.
Yeah.
Which is a substantial amount. It's certainly
Yep.
more than Halloween.
Yep.
But then you go through the series and you get something like 12 or 13 in part 4. By part 6, you get something like 18.
Yeah.
Which is a lot. I think the peak is about 23 kills.
Yeah.
I think that's Jason X, which actually I quite like.
It's insane. I mean, if you look at, there's this brilliant thing on Rotten Tomatoes, actually. I'm assuming it's accurate, but it's basically like a chart of all of the famous sort of slasher killers in movies and the body count, how many people each of them killed. At the bottom of the ladder, you've got Norman Bates, who killed 20 people, which actually is still quite a lot. You've got Leatherface there, which has got 30. You've got Freddy, 39. You've got Ghostface, which is 49. You've got Jigsaw at 60. You've got Michael Myers at 107. And of course, right at the top of the ladder is Jason Voorhees with 146 kills. He is officially the king of the slashers. So I think let's take this opportunity to talk a little bit about all the sequels and the evolution of Jason Voorhees.
I don't want to scare anyone, but I'm going to give it to you straight about Jason. His body was never recovered from the lake after he drowned. And if you listen to the old-timers in town, they'll tell you he's still out there. Some sort of demented creature. Surviving in the wilderness. Full grown by now. Stalking. Stealing what he needs. Living off wild animals and vegetation. Some folks claim they've even seen him. Right in this area. Legend has it that Jason saw his mother beheaded that night, and that he took his revenge. A revenge that he'll continue to seek if anyone ever enters his wilderness again. Jason's out there.
So obviously in the first one, what we learn about Jason was that he was this little boy who drowned back in the 1950s. He had certain sort of facial deformities and learning disabilities. He drowns in the lake but somehow doesn't drown and survives, and then apparently spends the next 20 years or so just hanging out in the woods. And that's when we get to Friday the 13th, Part 2.
On a June night in 1980, Friday the 13th, 12 of her friends were murdered. Why should Friday the 13th, 1981 be any different? Friday the 13th, Part 2. The body count continues.
So Friday the 13th Part 2 is set 1 year later, and it's very similar to the first one, except that it's not a whodunit. We know that it's Jason. There's less kind of point of view shots with the murders and more actually seeing this real guy
murdering people. The first scene is actually him killing the girl who beheaded his mother at the end of the first one. So the final girl, Alice, from part 1 is the first death in part 2, and that actually becomes a bit of a slasher trope as well. But Jason in this one, it's kind of early Jason. He is quite skinny, quite scrappy. He wears this sack over his head, and he's like this crazy woodsman type person. He's quite scrawny, and he's a bit more kind of rednecky, I suppose.
Certainly not iconic, though.
No, not at all. I'd say the most memorable thing about part 2 is the death where the guy is killed on the wheelchair and then kind of pushed backwards all the way down the steps in the thunder and lightning. That's quite a cool, quite creepy looking image, and I think that's amongst sort of Friday the 13th fans, that's a really popular death scene. There's also one where a guy's kind of hanging upside down by a tree from a rope and gets his throat slashed as well, and that's quite a creepy image. There's some quite good deaths, but there's a lot of them, and you know, as many as there are good ones, there are also lots of very unmemorable ones. Essentially, it's a very generic early 80s slasher movie, very, very similar to the first one. It's just the only thing that's notable about it is it's the first one with Jason.
Friday the 13th, Part 3. A new dimension in terror.
Friday the 13th Part 3 is mainly notable for two reasons. Firstly, when it was originally out in cinemas, it was in 3D. This was in the middle of a big kind of 80s 3D craze. And also, it is the first movie in which Jason acquires the hockey mask.
How does he attain the hockey mask?
One of the characters takes it with him and scares a friend. There's a moment, there's a fake jump scare where he jumps out on his friend wearing a hockey mask. And anyway, then he gets killed by Jason, and Jason puts this hockey mask on. And then there's a moment, and it's very Halloween-esque with like the sheet in Halloween, where one of the other characters sees Jason wearing the hockey mask, and they're like, "Oh, stop messing about," thinking it's the mate that scared them earlier, and it turns out to be Jason. And then he keeps that mask on. But essentially, other than that, it's pretty much Part 3 is. Again, another pretty much replica of 1 and 2. You know, you've got a bunch of kids staying at the camp, and they are offed one by one in different ways. The quite funny thing about watching Part 3 now is that you can see that it was clearly shot with this kind of 3D gimmick in mind. And obviously now watching it at home on DVD, it's 2D. So you've got these really bizarre long shots where you've got a kid playing with a yo-yo that head goes in and out towards the screen, or Jason shooting somebody with this sort of harpoon gun thing that comes straight at the camera lens, and various kind of silly looking deaths like that originally, I suppose, were meant to be some kind of cool 3D effect, but now just look even more cheesy than they would otherwise. So overall, I'd say this is a pretty average slasher movie. Again, probably slightly worse than Part 2. It's got some funny moments in it. It's also got some really irritating characters. One of the characters called Shelley, a guy who actually, the guy who wears the hockey mask, he's this kind of trickster, prankster. One of the most irritating characters in the whole Friday the 13th series, I think. So again, we're starting now at this point to introduce the idea of characters who are, so deliberately unlikable that they are purely there as good setup for a good murder scene.
Friday the 13th, the final chapter. Jason is back.
So in the fourth Friday the 13th movie, this is where Jason becomes, I think, what we all know as Jason proper, because this is where he's now wearing the hockey mask and carrying the machete. And I think the fourth one was originally supposed to be the final chapter. I mean, it was called
the final chapter.
The final chapter. Oh,
but it made money.
What a lie that was. But actually, out of all those early Friday the 13th, the fourth one is the best, I would say. It's the best of the whole bunch. Tom Savini comes back, and he is involved in all the sort of practical makeup effects. You've got some brilliant death scenes. You've got some good tension. It feels like it's been directed by a man who knows what he's doing. I mean, this is directed by Joseph Zito, and he does quite a good job. It's a little bit more slick and stylish. And you've also got some characters who are actually characters. You've got Crispin Glover in this movie, who's great. You've got the character of Tommy Jarvis, who actually becomes quite an important character in the next couple of movies, and he's played by a very, very young Corey Feldman. And there's this whole story of him and his sister who kind of live across the road from the camp, who kind of live around the corner. So finally, they kind of introducing slightly new elements into this. And the fact that Tommy was obsessed with masks and building prosthetic masks was kind of a tribute to Tom Savini as well. So there's some interesting stuff in this. There's a little bit more characterization. There's some quite good makeup
effects and practical effects. There's some good kills. And I think if this was the final chapter, if there were no more Friday the 13th after this, I think we all would have said that this series ended on a high. But alas, this wasn't the end.
Friday the 13th, Part 5, A New Beginning.
So a mere 1 year later after the final chapter, we get A New Beginning, which doesn't include Jason at all.
Jason was in it, but it wasn't Jason.
Yeah, it was a copycat Jason. I think fans were livid.
Although you'd think, I guess the fans were fans because they love Jason, as you said.
Yeah.
But it's kind of clever.
Yeah,
is it?
I didn't mind that idea. I think the idea was okay, but it wasn't well executed. That was the problem, was that it was actually a very bad film. I think it's the worst of all the sequels. So as well as not having Jason, it was also just very poorly directed. I think the director of that fifth one had only previously done porn and stuff, and it was just rubbish.
Were the sex scenes any good?
No, actually, weirdly. And there's a bit when one guy gets killed on the toilet while he's taking a shit. And I guess that's kind of quite emblematic of the quality of Friday the 13th, A New Beginning. And you've also got this character of Tommy Jarvis, who was Corey Feldman from the previous one. Sadly, it's not Corey Feldman anymore. And it's supposed to be kind of set up like he may or may not be the psychopath as well. But again, it's not done very well. All of these ideas are kind of good in theory, but just badly executed. So yeah, Friday the 13th, A New Beginning is probably the worst of the series, is not recommended, a complete write-off.
You know, if the institution ever found out about this, they would haul our butts back in and straitjacket them. Permanent.
You didn't have to come, Haas. This is between me and Jason.
I know. But I still don't get the therapy here. All you need to know is Jason's dead, right? Seeing his corpse ain't gonna stop the hallucinations.
Seeing it won't, but destroying it will. Jason belongs in hell. I'm gonna see he gets there.
So then we've got part 6, Jason Lives. So I think at this point the studio panicked and thought, let's just bring him back.
We've got to bring him back.
Yeah.
We know how ludicrous this franchise could be, or is.
Mm-hmm.
And he gets Frankensteined, essentially.
Yes.
Someone thinks that it would be a good idea. I think it's Tommy from parts 4 and 5, who's been played by 3 different actors or something by this point. He decides that to get revenge on Jason, who's dead for his sister's death, he will dismember the corpse, or like just attack the corpse. And then so he impales him with a stake from the railings of the cemetery, and then lightning strikes him. And he's reanimated. So at this point, you know, it's completely supernatural.
Yeah.
Jason can be whatever they want him to be.
Yeah.
He can be as immortal as you like.
Exactly. And this is the point where he stops being this, like, you know, slightly mentally unhinged boy that grew up in the woods to now being this, like, proper kind of zombie character, isn't he? And he's much more... And I think it was part 6, maybe part 7, when Kane Hodder started to play him. And he really had that physique of... He's built like a tank. And he has this kind of rotting face with maggots in him. And he wears the overalls and he has the machete, and that's really when we achieve kind of peak Jason status.
For sure. It's kind of strange, isn't it? Like part 6 of a franchise is when you get that iconic.
It's when you get it. Yeah, it's really interesting, and actually part 6 is great fun. I think it's one of the best of all the sequels. It's got a little bit of a sort of meta vibe going on. You've got people that kind of know about the legend of Jason, and they make jokes about how, if you go to this camp you will die, kind of a thing, and they kind of make jokes about it. And there are comments as well about sort of, I've seen enough horror movies to know that we shouldn't be doing this. And so it's got a bit of humour in it. It's got a bit of a wink wink nudge nudge element to it. And also what I really like about this one is it's the first fucking one where you actually have kids in the summer camp. This has all been set in a kids summer camp, every single movie, and yet we've not seen the kids yet. This is the first time when we actually have children in peril as well as teenagers. So it's got a big cast of characters. It's completely silly. It is ridiculous. You've got this zombie Jason now, officially back from the dead. But I think the series was kind of finding its way now at this point. This is now, like you just said, like this is now what we think of with Friday the 13th and Jason Voorhees from this movie onwards. You've got this big unkillable tank. It worries, to be honest, a lot less about being scary and suspenseful than the original few did, and more about how can we entertain people with the most extreme murder scenes imaginable.
Jason.
is back. But this time, someone is waiting. Friday the 13th, Part 7, The New Blood.
Part 7 is the one that a lot of people dubbed Jason versus Carrie, and this is A New Blood, and this is basically where Jason goes up against a woman with telekinesis. So, again, we're in absolute fantasy territory now with Jason Voorhees. You know, we've come a very long way from old Mrs. Voorhees back in 1980 by this point. And this movie is a bit of a disappointment, to be honest. I think when you've got a setup like that, where you've got, you know, fantastical elements, we're now in the late 80s with this franchise. We're in a post-Freddy, post-Nightmare on Elm Street world with slashers, where people could be a bit more imaginative with slashers. This film felt like a missed opportunity. It could have been a bit more imaginative. If you've got Jason going up against, you know, you've got zombie Jason going up against this telekinetic girl, but it never really pulls it off. And also tonally, the movie doesn't quite know where it belongs. You've got these kind of quite dark backstories between Tina, the telekinetic girl, and her dad that feels like it should belong in a completely different movie. And then you've got the really campy, silly, you know, Camp Crystal Lake murders going on with a bunch of teenagers at the same time. So it's just a bit of a mess, this movie, to be honest. But another notable thing about it historically is that this is the first movie in which Kane Hodder plays Jason. So again, the guy who is pretty much now synonymous with Jason didn't play him for the first time until Part 7, which is unbelievable, really.
Part 8. Jason takes Manhattan. Now, New York has a new problem.
In Part 8, Jason takes a little break from Camp Crystal Lake and he goes to Manhattan.
Of course he does.
Takes a little boat trip, but stupidly, he doesn't actually arrive in Manhattan until about the last 10 minutes, and the first hour and a half is set just on the boat while he's killing people off on the boat.
Well, that's slightly different.
Yeah, slightly different, change of pace, I suppose, but it's more or less the exact same thing. He's working his way through a whole bunch of teenagers, mostly extremely irritating, on this big boat that's heading towards Manhattan. It does have some excellent 80s music in it.
Fallen angels lead to the street. It's an empty dance, and so incomplete.
And it also has one brilliant death scene in which he literally punches a guy's head off. He gets to Manhattan, he gets in this fight with this guy on the roof of a building. This guy decides it's a good idea to start boxing Jason. He starts punching him repeatedly, over and over again. Jason barely flinches. Jason then reacts to this by throwing one swift punch, and his head comes clean off. It flies off this roof, drops down onto the bonnet of a police car down below. That's quite a funny moment. Other than that, there's not much interesting to this movie. I think the idea was there to take him to Manhattan, and they thought they were going to have a lot more money than they did to film in some interesting New York settings, when actually by this point the series was on the decline, funnily enough, now that we're in Part 8. Part 7 hadn't done as well as they had hoped, and Paramount massively cut the budget for Part 8. And this was actually the last Friday the 13th movie that Paramount would do, but they cut their budget massively, hence why all the killings and all the set pieces take place on a boat and not in Manhattan, as the title would suggest.
Horror has many faces. Death wears many different masks. But pure evil wears only one. And this is your final chance to see it. Jason Goes to Hell. The final Friday.
Jason Goes to Hell, the final Friday. So we'd already obviously had one part the final chapter, which promised to be the last in the series. And this is the next installment that promised to be the last in the series. So the final Friday, the opening scene is quite interesting and quite fun because it's something that if you've watched the previous 8 Friday the 13th movies, you'd be yelling at the screen about. You'd be saying, why don't they just fly in a big SWAT team of people that could literally just blow him up or shoot him to death with machine guns? And that's essentially what happens. The opening scene of the final Friday starts off like a classic Friday the 13th movie. A girl has got out the lake, she's naked, she's in a towel, then she starts getting stalked and chased by Jason. We think she's going to die, and then it turns out she's an actress, she's a plant, and she's lured Jason into the woods where all of these floodlights suddenly come on. Jason finds himself surrounded by SWAT teams and soldiers, and he is blown to smithereens, and that is the beginning of the final Friday. I won't tell you what happens beyond that in case you ever do want to watch it, but sure enough, it's not the end of Jason. He does find a way to claw his way back into the real world. And, you know, the movie itself is quite fun. Again, it's a little bit different from the usual teenagers getting killed in Camp Crystal Lake. So I quite like that about it. But again, it kind of had ideas above its status a little bit. It kind of had some interesting stuff that it was trying to do and didn't execute it very well. And perhaps the most notable thing about Jason Goes to Hell, the final Friday, is that it's the first movie in the series not funded by Paramount but by New Line Cinema, and this means that it is now existing in the world of Freddy Krueger. And there's a little end sting where Freddy Krueger actually kills Jason and kind of pulls his mask underground. So that is obviously a little hint of what's to come.
In the year 2455, on a routine training mission, a team of students is about to discover a life form frozen in time.
What the hell is going on?
Jason Voorhees, that's what's going on. He's an unstoppable killing machine.
And then you've got Jason X in space.
Now, Jason X, so obviously we're children of the 90s,
yeah,
you know, growing up with films of the 90s, and that hit at peak slasher moment, and they knew they could be as ridiculous as they liked.
Yeah,
and they sent him to space,
and they had fun with it. I think it became kind of comedy horror, like Jason X, and actually all the better for it, I think.
Certainly, and they knew that they could kill people in whatever way they deemed fun and outlandish. I think it's got one of my favourite deaths in the whole franchise, which is, I'm going to forget, it's got about 50 characters.
Yes.
But one of the ladies, she gets her head put in, is it ice cold water or liquid nitrogen or something?
Yeah.
And then he smashes her head on the table, and you're just like,
it's brilliant. That was a big crowd pleaser, Jason X. I think by this point, like you said, we're in a kind of post-Scream world. People weren't watching Friday the 13th films to be scared anymore or to take them seriously. They're watching them in a kind of ironic way. You're watching Jason in an ironic way. You're cheering when he murders people. You're not scared of him. And what I think a lot of the later Friday the 13th got wrong, like in The New Blood with the telekinetic girl, or even Jason Goes to Hell, the final Friday, is that they took themselves very seriously. They were very faced, and they were going for the kind of pure evil Michael Myers approach when actually they should be going for the tongue-in-cheek silly approach, which is absolutely what Jason X does, and it does it really well, and it's got a bit of money behind it so that they can make those deaths particularly spectacular.
Welcome to my nightmare. Freddy versus Jason.
Place your bets.
Freddy vs. Jason. Now, obviously, we haven't yet discussed A Nightmare on Elm Street, but we will be in 2 or 3 weeks' time. So I don't want to go into this too deeply yet. I think we're going to save the latter Friday the 13th movies, such as this and the remake, for an episode later on down the line. But suffice to say, Freddy vs. Jason is pretty fucking stupid, has some quite funny lines, some quite silly moments, some quite good death scenes, but is overall pretty rubbish.
His name was Jason, and today is his birthday.
And there you go. That's your very, very brief rundown there of the entire Friday the 13th franchise. I think I did pretty well there in remembering the individual plots and elements of of every single movie. So, who knows what's going to happen next with Friday the 13th. We did have a remake about 10 years ago, and there are talks of more Friday the 13th. Paramount did actually want to make another one that was going to be released, I think, this year, but it all fell through. They had some disastrous box office results with horror movies recently, such as Rings, the sequel to The Ring, which was a big flop. And after that flopped, they pulled the plug on a new Friday the 13th movie. So who knows now? Will we get another Friday the 13th? Will we see Jason ever again? Do we want to see Jason ever again?
Horror has this reputation, as we discussed before, of being sort of lower.
Yes.
And that's because people don't come up with any fresh ideas.
Yeah, exactly.
Stop remaking old films and come up with something new.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. And I think Friday the 13th is
to blame.
Is responsible for a lot of this. It kind of is, in an interesting way. And I like them. I find them quite fun. But I'm also very aware that they are the movies that invented the tropes that people roll their eyes about in horror movies.
Yeah,
But
you've got to look at the first one properly.
Yes.
And realise it's much better than most of them.
Yeah.
Okay, the others might have more fun deaths or be better shot or whatever.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the story and the things it suggests, it's far more interesting.
There's actually a story there. And
Having rewatched a lot of these sort of sequels and remakes, I do find that I'm pretty bored in the first 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Like, if you're going to set them up as characters, make us care for them.
Yes.
And you just don't in any of the Friday the 13th. You don't know who they are, really.
Yep.
All you know is they're young and mostly attractive.
They are literally just pieces of meat to be disposed of, aren't they? Would you recommend these films in general? I suppose that's the fundamental question. Is it any good?
These films or this film?
Okay, let's go with the first one.
Yes, I would recommend the first one.
Yeah.
And not just as a study in, looking at where horror's been and where it's going. It is interesting. It has some interesting ideas.
Yep.
Like you said, the killer is unexpected.
Yep.
Although we have given it all away, so if you've not seen it before, sorry.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is good.
Yeah.
It's fairly shonkily made. But that's okay.
But a lot of those old horrors are, and they're still powerful.
And the effects are decent, considering. It's fun, and it's not long. It sticks to the classic horror movie 90 minutes, which is perfect.
And actually, it kind of spaces out, because you've got that opening scene with the deaths, and then you've got that fake final girl who dies. You get kills quite frequently throughout, I think if they had not had that fake final girl death, there would have been like an hour gap before all the others start getting picked off. So maybe that was another reason where they sort of thought, we need to have a kill at least every 15-20 minutes, and stuck that one in,
Sure, maybe.
But it's quite a good idea. I think I would probably recommend this film as well. And I'm probably, by the sounds of it, I'm more of a fan than you of the franchise as a whole.
Certainly, I'm a Nightmare on Elm Street.
Oh, me too. Me too. We'll get to that in a couple of weeks' time. But I did used to love them when I was a teenager. I don't know necessarily now whether I'd ever sit down on my own and pop a Friday the 13th on, But again, these movies, they don't feel like they were designed for that. They feel like they're designed to watch with friends, having a few drinks, having a bit of a laugh at it, really.
Yeah, I think the thing is, rewatching them, they're not... If you found them scary the first time, great. Although, like you said, mostly it's just about,
Yeah, exactly. It's a little applause and a whoop.
But second time round, you know who's going to die, in what order they're going to die, because that's the whole point of the film.
Yeah.
It loses any dread or tension you have.
Yeah.
And so really you've only got the excitement of the death. So yeah, you need to sit down with friends with a couple of beers on Halloween.
Yeah.
Have fun.
And have a bit of a laugh.
That's the key with horror, is that it doesn't have... it can be scary, and it needs to be scary, but it can also be really fun.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe in a different setting, not on your own in your room. That's probably not the best way to have fun with a horror film.
No.
But certainly a series like Friday the 13th, you can have a lot of fun with.
They're definitely, I agree. It's like the quintessential sort of fun horror series, I would say. You're not going to watch them to watch high art in any way.
No.
Which you could argue John Carpenter's Halloween, you could.
Well, I watched it recently, and you noticed that... Well, you're not supposed to notice, but I had my little critical head on.
Yeah.
And it feels like a real film.
Yes.
There's proper camera moves.
Yeah.
It's well lit. It's just well done.
Yeah.
And this
It's a bit scrappy in comparison. Yeah, exactly. And okay, another big important question.
Okay.
Jason or Michael? Who do you prefer? Who's better? Who would you least want to come up against as well?
I think I find Michael scarier.
Yes.
Because, especially in the first film, you don't know why he's killing them.
Yeah. And he feels like more of a kind of ethereal presence than this big hulking.
Yeah, he's not
monster.
an out and out beast.
Yeah.
Although he does become that by the later
of
the later
course.
films. But I think he's the one that scares me more.
Yeah.
Although I wouldn't want to meet either of them.
Yes.
But I guess that's that thing of when you watch Laurie Strode or any of the nameless people from the Friday the 13th series, you just think you need to not be so stupid and try and fight back. Don't just lie there and scream. Like, try and kill him or do something. I don't know. And both of them are going to overpower you probably. But try.
But I agree with you. I think Michael Myers is definitely a scarier bad guy to come up against. I think there's something more evil there, isn't there? Maybe it's just I sound like Donald Pleasance in that film. But
anyway, let's return to Friday the 13th now as we start to wrap things up then. So back to 1980. Before we knew that there were going to be an absolute barrage of sequels, what we did know was that Friday the 13th was such a huge success that it launched a whole slasher movement. This is when the slasher craze really began, and we had what felt like, I think, literally hundreds of movies that followed almost this exact same format. You had what looked like, when you look back on it now, it must have been a slasher movie every week, from The Prowler to The Burning to My Bloody Valentine to Prom Night to Terror Train to all of these movies that they just exactly followed the format of Friday the 13th and churned them out, and all of them were hugely successful. So it was obviously just what young people wanted at this time. It was absolutely bombarded with them.
And it's interesting, and I'm sure you'll talk about this in a later episode, but in the 90s and early noughties, they did it again. So the slasher became a huge thing after Scream. And they remade those ones that weren't good in the first place and made them rubbish again.
Yeah, exactly. It's an amazing thing. The slasher films are an amazing thing. I think it goes to show that they don't even have to be of any quality a lot of the time to do well or to please crowds. They just have to have some good death scenes. I think that is fundamentally it.
For sure.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we've pretty much talked Friday the 13th to death.
Decapitated with a shovel.
Yes, although it may well come back because we probably will go into some of the sequels and the later movies again later on down the line, because basically from this point onwards there's always going to be a Friday the 13th movie that's coming out around the same time as every other movie we discuss. So I'm sure it will rear its ugly head one more time. Rob, thank you so much for coming back and joining us again.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been wonderful. So where can people find you?
Twitter at RobWatts88, and my blog, which is linked to the Twitter, outsideofadream.wordpress.com. Find me there.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to my co-host for this week, Rob Watts. Rob will be back again very soon. If you want to get in touch with us, then please do. The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com, and you can tweet us at evolutionpod, and you can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/evolutionofhorror. I'm keen to hear what you guys think of the Friday the 13th franchise. Do you think it's any good? Is it a one-trick pony, or is there more fun to be had than meets the eye? What's your favourite Friday the 13th movie? What's your favourite Friday the 13th kill? Most importantly, do you prefer Jason or do you prefer Mrs. Voorhees? Please do get in touch anytime. I love to hear from you guys. If you want to find me personally, I'm on Twitter at The Movie Mike, and I do another podcast with co-host Rihanna Dillon. That's called Back Row, and you can find that on iTunes or on Twitter at Back Row Films. Next week, we are moving into the slasher boom of the 1980s. And rather than focus on one particular movie, that was just too difficult, really, because there are hundreds of them, and some of them are brilliant, some of them are terrible, but it felt like there were too many, and I wanted to mention all of them. So instead of doing one spoilerific review next week, I'm actually going to be chatting to the brilliant Michael Blythe, the guy who has seen pretty much every 80s slasher under the sun, and he's going to give us his list, his personal recommendations of the 10 or 20 best slasher movies from the 1980s. So we will not be spoiling anything for next week. It's purely going to work as a roundup of this whole era from sort of 1980 to 1985 of the best and worst of the slasher movies. Join me next week for all of this and more on the Evolution